Tonight is the first in what we plan to be a series of debates on current economic and policy issues, which is organized by the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. And tonight we will be debating the following proposition, which is we worked out jointly with the speakers. So the proposition is resolved: social democracy is preferable to market capitalism, but ultimately America will need to move towards a socialist system. Before getting into the topic in a little bit more detail and introducing the speakers, let me just say a brief word about CROE, the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, which is organizing the debate. Our mission at CROE is to support and disseminate economic and policy research with a particular focus on state-level issues. Outreach and education and discussion are key areas of our mission, which motivated our interest in organizing tonight's debate, as the topic is certainly relevant, not only in the state, but around the world. Our website, croe.wisc.edu, will point you to our other recent work. And this would normally be the time when I would also advertise coming activities. We had several in the works for the semester, but those will all be rescheduled. So look for more events in the fall. And finally, along those lines, I just, again, thank you all for coming tonight. And I just ask that everyone be cautious. We're very grateful that our speakers traveled here in these circumstances. And we just ask that for their sake and all of ours, everyone keep appropriate distance, don't shake hands, and we'll all be safe and get through this. Finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Study of Liberal Democracy, and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, both here at the UW, as well as the Institute for Humane Studies, who through their Hayek Fund provided some support. So to get into the topic in more detail, I have to start with a classic line. A specter is haunting America, the specter of socialism. Of course, this specter has haunted America before. In fact, in preparing for this debate, I came across the transcript of a debate on capitalism versus socialism held 99 years ago in New York, featuring the head of the Columbia Economics Department and a professor from the now defunct Rand School of Social Science. Of course, much has changed since that time. The debate in 1921 was held in the shadow of the Russian Revolution and the corresponding backlash in the Red Scare in the US. In fact, the socialist participant in the 1921 debate had actually been previously arrested and prosecuted for writing against the US World War I effort. We are under no fear of that happening tonight.
It's not over.
So much has changed since then. Oh, sorry, where was I? But rather than go into detail on the history of American engagement with socialism, which I'm sure will come out in the debate tonight, let me just give a brief description of some of the recent resurgence in interest in these ideas. So there's a recent book called We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism American Style, which begins in the following way, and I quote. In his 2019 State of the Union address, Donald Trump declared, "America will never be a socialist country." At the same time, David Brooks, writing in the New York Times, wrote that the American left is on the cusp of a great victory. More than any time since World War I, over 100 years ago, Americans are talking about socialism. Conservatives fear it. Liberals question it. Many progressives and radicals embrace it. Why is that word and the egalitarian vision it defines enjoying a resurgence in the United States? In 2016, Bernie Sanders captured the nation's attention in more than 13 million votes. And of course, up until perhaps 2 weeks ago, he appeared to be the front runner for the Democratic presidential nomination this year. Moreover, there were prominent Democratic socialists, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib, had been elected to Congress in 2018. And according to just one example of a 2019 Gallup poll, 43% of all Americans and 58% of all Americans between 18 and 34 believe that socialism would be a good thing for the country. But while socialism is on the rise, exactly what it means is unclear. And that's one dimension in which the current is like the past. So in particular, in the transcript of the 1921 debate, the introduction read, "There exists the greatest confusion in the minds of public and editors in America as to what constitutes socialism. To most of our leading writers, there's no difference between socialism, Bolshevism, communism, anarchism. They're all anathema to the American businessman who lumps them all together and fears them. But he went on. Hence, any occasion such as this is to be heartily welcomed, not only for its educational value, but because it indicates our return to our American policy of talking things out on their merits fairly and openly. And that's what we're going to try to do here tonight. So along those lines, in order to have a fair, open debate and discussion of the resolution, let me welcome our speakers. Speaking in favor of the proposition is Brian Leiter. Brian is the Carl M. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the Center for Law, Philosophy, and Human Values at the University of Chicago Law School. He's an expert on moral, political, and legal philosophy, constitutional law, evidence, freedom of speech, and religion, and academic freedom. He's worked on numerous topics, and among his books include Naturalizing Jurisprudence, Why Tolerate Religion, and the most recent, Moral Psychology with Nietzsche. He also blogs frequently at leiterreports.com, which I suggest you check out. Arguing against the proposition is the other Bryan Caplan. Bryan, or Caplan, is a professor of economics at George Mason University and senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. Professor Caplan specializes in public economics, public choice, public opinion, and the economics of the family. Caplan is author of several books, including The Myth of the Rational Voter, The Case Against Education, and most recently, it's very interesting, the graphic nonfiction book, Open Borders, which was written with Zach Weiner-Smith, who does Saturday morning breakfast cereal, if any of you are familiar with that. He's also a blogger at EconBlog. Before getting into the debate, let me just go over very briefly the ground rules. We will have 10-minute opening statements by each of our participants, followed by a 5-minute response and rebuttal. After that, we'll have some time for guided Q&A, moderated questions and answers, questions posed by me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So be ready with questions when the time comes. We'll just, form an orderly line and take questions at the time. Was there a question already? Yes.
Yeah, could you restate the proposition again?
Yes. I was going to do that right before we got to it, so let's say it. The resolution is social democracy is preferable to market capitalism, but ultimately America will need to move toward a socialist system. So, as is tradition, those arguing in favor of the proposition will go first, so we turn the floor over to Professor Leiter.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Professor Williams, for inviting me, and Professor Caplan for agreeing to discuss these issues with me and with us tonight. I should mention that I've been suffering from nasal polyps for 2 months, so don't be alarmed by my periodic coughing. So I'm both a lawyer and a philosopher by training, and philosophers especially like to start by defining their terms. So that's where I'm going to begin. By capitalism, I mean an economic system in which the primary means by which a society produces what its people need and want, food, housing, energy, transportation, and so on, are owned by private individuals or corporations whose aim is to make a profit by producing these things. Exxon, Amazon, Kraft Heinz, Apple, Tyson Foods, General Motors are all examples of privately owned capitalist producers. Capitalist countries vary in how much the government undertakes two activities that interfere with or alter the capitalist marketplace. First, capitalist societies differ in how much they regulate or restrict the activities of capitalist producers in order to prevent harms to others. Examples of such restrictions would include environmental regulations and regulation of working conditions. Second, governments differ in how much they try to offset or correct for the ways in which transactions in the capitalist marketplace exacerbate people's bad luck. That is, the chance starting points in life in which people find themselves which hinder their effective participation in the market. For example, being born into poverty, or in a disfavored racial or religious group, or suffering from various illnesses or chronic disabilities. Social insurance schemes like Medicare and Social Security, as well as affirmative action, are recent examples of such policies in America. By social democracies, I mean capitalist societies in which government is quite aggressive in regulating capitalism to reduce harms, and in which the government provides social insurance to protect citizens against bad luck. Otto von Bismarck, the 19th century statesman and militarist who unified Germany, is the father of modern social insurance. Someone who accused him of being a socialist at the time would likely have been arrested. A later German leader, Adolf Hitler, was also a social democrat, as well as a fascist and genocidal maniac. But his ascent to power was welcomed by the leaders of German capitalism at the time, not because they were genocidal maniacs, but because they feared actual socialism. For actual socialism is rather different than social democracy. Under socialism, the main ways a society produces what people need to live are under collective control, which usually means government control. The local bakery or dry cleaner are of no concern to socialism, nor is the fact that citizens own their home or their clothes or furniture. But Amazon, Exxon, Tyson Foods, General Motors, and the like, they are. In a social society, they cease to exist as privately controlled entities whose main purpose is to generate profit for their owners. Under socialism, they are collectively owned, and their main purpose is to produce what is needed to meet human needs in order to liberate people from the struggle for survival. Socialism has one central goal: to enable people to live freely, in particular to live free of coercion, including the coercion of economic necessity. This bears emphasizing. Everyone agrees that if a robber points a gun at my head and says, "Hand over your wallet," I am not free to decline. Of course, I could, but who would trade their life for some credit cards and dollars? The robber coerces me into handing over the money. For most people under capitalism, it is not fundamentally different. If your choices are take this job or starve, you have no free choice. If your choice is to take this job or do without the medical insurance and thus access to the medical care you need, you are being coerced to take the job. Freedom from necessity and coercion by necessity is the central animating ideal of socialism. Not altruism, not cooperation, but freedom. Obviously, most leaders who claim to be socialists, or for that matter, believers in free markets, are not. The fact that Hitler was a social democrat and popular with capitalists, or that the fascist dictator Pinochet in Chile was devoted to the Chicago School of Free Market Economics, or that Castro and Mao claimed to be socialists, are irrelevant to any serious discussion of the merits of capitalism, social democracy, or socialism. So much by way of defining terms. Now, I favor a return to stronger social democracy for America, which is what Senator Sanders from Vermont favors, although it is unfortunate he calls himself a socialist. I have seen no evidence that he is. He is like Bismarck, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and almost every leader of a European country in the last 70 years, a social democrat. I am not going to say much about the argument for social democracy tonight, since I think it obvious that most people in capitalist societies are better off under social democracy. From 1946 to 1980, when the United States still enjoyed the benefits of the social democracy that Roosevelt established, real GDP nearly doubled, and those in the bottom half of the income distribution saw their income increase by 102%, while those in the top 1% saw an increase of 47%. With Ronald Reagan's attack on American social democracy starting in 1980, things changed. Between 1980 and 2014, real income increased by just 61%, but those in the bottom half saw only a 1% gain, while the top 1% of earners saw their income triple. As the economist and columnist Paul Krugman recently wrote regarding the very social democratic Nordic countries in Europe, and I quote Krugman, "They have lower GDP per capita than we do, but that's largely because they take more vacations. Compared with America, they have higher life expectancy, much less poverty, and significantly higher overall life satisfaction. Oh," he adds, "and they have high levels of entrepreneurship because people are more willing to take the risk of starting a business when they know that they won't lose their health care or plunge into abject poverty if they fail." That's Krugman. Anyone can review the public evidence. Affluent capitalist societies that offer strong social democratic protections, from Australia to Canada to Singapore, produce better outcomes for their citizens on almost every dimension of well-being: health, age, education, happiness. Now, what I do want to argue tonight is that even though socialism is not yet right for America, if we do not become a socialist country at some point in the future, almost everyone in this room or your descendants is doomed. My argument does not appeal to altruism or charity. Socialism has nothing to do with appeals to do-gooder or altruistic instincts. Socialism points out the fundamental irrationality of capitalism as a system of production and appeals to the self-interest of the vast majority of people. So let me explain. Capitalists, those who control production and thus make investment and production decisions, are out to make profit from what they own. Because capitalist producers compete against each other, they are incentivized to innovate, develop new productive technologies, and reduce their production costs where they can so as to increase their profitability. This accounts for why, as Karl Marx himself emphasized, capitalism is unparalleled in its ability to increase economic productivity. Indeed, as Marx noted, for socialism to even be possible, there must first be capitalism. For capitalism, and here I quote Marx, must necessarily have produced a great increase in productive power, a high degree of development. This development of productive forces is an absolutely necessary practical premise, because without it, want is merely made general, and with destitution, the struggle for necessities and all the old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced. That's Marx. Well, the struggle for necessities is exactly what so-called socialism in Mao's China and Castro's Cuba produced. Neither society had benefited from the remarkable growth in productive power that only capitalism in the history of our world has produced. But capitalists do not provide jobs for people out of altruistic concern for the welfare of others. They do so only because it is necessary to produce the goods that are their source of profit. All those whose lives depend upon wages from capitalist producers work and survive only as long as some capitalist needs them to. Because capitalist producers are always locked in life and death competition, struggles with other capitalists, they must reduce costs where they can and increase productivity where they can, sometimes doing both at the same time. Global corporations move jobs to India or Mexico for one simple reason: labor costs are lower there. Corporations embrace new technologies like robots because over the long term they are much cheaper than even human labor. Here's how the New York Times put it in a story about corporate executives meeting at the Davos World Economic Forum. They'll never admit it in public, but many of your bosses want machines to replace you as soon as possible. In private settings, these executives tell a different story. They are racing to automate their own workforces to stay ahead of the competition with little regard for the impact on workers. All over the world, executives are spending billions of dollars to transform their businesses into lean, digitized, highly automated operations. They crave the fat profit margins automation can deliver, and they see artificial intelligence as a golden ticket to savings, perhaps by letting them whittle departments with thousands of workers down to just a few dozen. In Davos, executives tend to speak about automation as a natural phenomenon over which they have no control, like hurricanes or heat waves. They claim if they don't automate jobs as quickly as possible, their competitors will. As to who will buy the products of their operations once all the workers are gone, well, that doesn't seem to occur to them. That's the New York Times. And that, in a journalistic nutshell, is the problem that faces us under capitalism. Capitalist producers must reduce their costs, for if they don't, their competitors will do so and then drive them out of business. Since the logic of capitalism demands reduction of production costs, and since the wages of most people under capitalism are simply production costs to be reduced or eliminated, this cannot end well. The only humane alternative is socialism, that is ultimately taking collective control of the immense productive power that capitalism generates so that its purpose is not the endless pursuit of profit, but producing what human beings need to live and flourish. That time is not yet at hand, but it may be sooner than we expect. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Caplan with the response. His opening.
All right, so it's a pleasure to begin with something where we agree. Namely, all first world countries are already social democracies. Their governments continue to allow markets to provide most goods and services, but they heavily regulate these markets, heavily subsidize favored sectors like education and health, and heavily redistribute income. The U.S. is moderately less social democratic than France or Sweden, But the idea that we have market capitalism and they have social democracy is just hyperbole. If you favor social democracy, you should be happy, because that's what we've already got and have had for a very long time. You won long ago. Free market rhetoric notwithstanding, the US has Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and public education, and strict regulation of labor markets, construction, and other major industries. My view, however, is that social democracy is an awful mistake. Despite its bad press, market capitalism would be much better than what we have now. Advocates of social democracy typically claim credit for three major improvements over market capitalism. First, they've used redistribution in order to greatly reduce poverty. Second, they've used regulation to make markets work better. And third, they've used government funding to provide wonderful services that markets neglect. I say they're greatly overstating their success on all three counts, while conveniently overlooking heavy collateral damage. Let's start with redistribution. The rhetoric of redistribution revolves around helping the poor. But when you look at redistribution in the real world, this is grossly misleading. The US government spends far more on the elderly, most of whom are not poor, than it spends on actual poverty programs. Programs like Social Security, Medicare are popular because they help everyone. But helping everyone is an extremely wasteful program because most of the people governments help would have been perfectly able to take care of themselves. Instead, we absurdly tax everyone to help everyone. This humanitarian rhetoric rings even more hollow when you examine the most important forms of government regulation. Domestically, nothing does more harm than our draconian regulation of the construction industry. This regulation, primarily state and local, makes it very hard to build new housing, especially in high-wage places like New York City and the Bay Area. It's hard to build tall buildings. It's hard to put in multifamily housing. You have to waste a lot of valuable land. Builders put houses on an acre of land because zoning regulation says that they have to. The connection between regulation and exorbitant housing prices is almost undeniable. In lightly regulated areas of the country like Texas, the business supplies ample cheap housing. Anytime someone tells you that government regulation makes markets work better, just take a look at San Francisco's housing market for a reality check. And this is hardly one tiny failure of regulation. Housing absorbs about 40% of the average American's budget. Immigration regulation is an even more egregious failure. The single best way for people around the world to escape poverty is to move to a high productivity country like the US and get a job. This benefits not only immigrants, but us, because we're their customers. The more they sell us, the better off we are. 100 years ago, immigration to the US was almost unregulated, giving people all over the world a viable way to escape poverty. Now, in contrast, regulation is very tightly regulated, especially for those most in need. Economists' estimates of the global harm of these regulations sums to tens of trillions of dollars per year, because each immigrant worker vastly enriches the world, and hundreds of millions of workers wish to come. Again, this is the opposite of one tiny failure of regulation. And finally, what about education, healthcare, and other sectors that government subsidizes? I say these policies are crowd-pleasing, but extremely wasteful. Yes, more educated workers do make more money, but the main reason is not that you're learning useful skills. Most of what you study in school is irrelevant in the real world. I think I'm on safe ground here, right? All right. Our degrees mostly pay by convincing employers that you're smarter, hardworking, and more conformist than the competition. That's why there's been severe credential inflation since World War II. The more degrees workers have, the more degrees you need to convince employers that not to throw your application in the trash. Pouring money in education is an exercise in futility. The same goes for healthcare. Almost every researcher who measures the effect of healthcare on health agrees this effect is much smaller than what the public imagines. Diet, exercise, substance abuse, and other lifestyle choices are much more important for health than access to medicine. But these facts notwithstanding, the government lavishes funding on medical care that barely improves our health. If this seems implausible, just compare American life expectancy to Mexico's. Medicare plus Medicaid is over $1 trillion a year, and Americans live about 1.5 years longer than Mexicans. Now, a reasonable social democrat could object, fine, actual social democracies cause great harm and waste insane amounts of money. But we can imagine a social democracy that limits itself to helping hungry kids and refugees, fighting infectious disease, I haven't forgotten, right? And other well-targeted programs for the betterment of humanity. So frankly, I'll say that abolishing everything except for those well-targeted programs sounds really close to market capitalism to me. And it also sounds like wishful thinking. In the real world, governments with a lot of power and a vague mandate to help people reliably do great harm. This is true in the US and it's true in Sweden. Yes, the Swedes strangle their construction industry too. Now, given all this, I predictably deny that ultimately America will need to move to a socialist system. Full-blown socialist systems make social democracy look great by comparison. Indeed, once you draw this distinction between social democracy and socialism, it's hard to find any socialist regime in history that is not a tragic, despotic disaster. If Sweden is the jewel of social democracy, what is the jewel of socialism? Right, it's not Cuba, I found out, but I am curious to find out what it is. Nor is there any sign that socialism somehow becomes more necessary as countries progress. The main reason governments have gotten bigger over the last 10 years is just the aging of the population. Finally, let me underscore what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that life in the US or Sweden is terrible. In fact, human beings in both countries enjoy close to the highest quality of life that human beings have ever achieved. My claim, rather, is that even the most successful countries in history could do far better. I know that social democratic policies are emotionally appealing. That's why they've won. But objectively speaking, market capitalism should have won because market capitalism offers much better results. Thank you.
Thank you. So before getting to questions, if you want to take a few minutes to respond to Professor Caplan's remarks.
I'll say a couple of things, but some of it we should clearly save for discussion. So history is young. We're about 250 years from the Industrial Revolution, about 60 or 70 years into the computer revolution. I'm not sure it's a sound principle to draw inductions over what we've seen so far. And I've already agreed with you, as you noted, right, that socialism presupposes productive plenty, and capitalism is crucial for productive plenty. We haven't seen socialism in any society that has actually achieved that. And I'm not sure America is ready for that either, as I said. But again, history is young, and the future, we hope, is quite long in front of us. Now, in terms of the merits of social democracy versus market capitalism, I think the only thing we really have to go on are the so-called natural experiments. That is, the different societies that are more or less like ours that have adopted much more aggressive social democratic policies than we have. I agree with Professor Caplan that we are a weak social democracy, not a strong one, but we are basically a social democracy. Those who have adopted more aggressive social democratic policies, and again, you can go look up Australia or Singapore or Canada, several of them extremely multicultural societies as well, and human beings do better on average there, and often not just on average, but at the higher end. I don't think we can decide the merits of social democracy versus market capitalism based on examining just particular policies. I have no views about regulation of the construction industry, so I won't even say anything about that. Social Security, the reason that the elderly aren't disproportionately poor in the United States is because of Social Security. That's pretty well documented, right? And is it true that some people get Social Security who are well-to-do? Yes. Is it a political reality in a capitalist society that it's very hard to get general support for a social insurance policy unless everybody benefits? That also seems to be true. I'm actually with Professor Caplan completely on the immigration issue, but he and I are such far outliers from the mainstream of public opinion on this that it's probably not worth dwelling on. I do want to say something about education. So Professor Caplan says, not incorrectly, I think, that education is irrelevant to the real world, except by the real world, what he means is the capitalist marketplace. And it is probably true that a lot of education is irrelevant to the capitalist marketplace, but there's a different question, which is that what education is for? So the University of Wisconsin exists as a model of a research university that was invented in Germany in the early 19th century. All American research universities are based on the German model. And the idea of the German model was not to cater to the marketplace. Right? The idea of the German model was to promote what the Germans called Bildung. That is, was to promote a certain kind of self-development and flourishing of the human being. And that may not be relevant for the capitalist marketplace, but it may be relevant to human beings who want to lead good lives. Now, we face a dilemma in America, and this is a separate debate that we can talk more about tonight, namely that when the cost of Bildung, of self-development and individual flourishing becomes exorbitant, as it has in the higher education marketplace in the United States, in part because of overpaid professors like myself and Professor Caplan, and maybe even Professor Williams, then the question arises, well, what is the economic payoff? And I'm not at all unsympathetic to why people are worried about that. But I do think it's important with respect to subsidies for education, right, to remember that they have purposes other than simply making people fit for the marketplace. And I think I'll stop there, and then we'll talk about more later. Thank
Great.
you.
All right.
Yes, Professor Caplan, if you want to respond to that or elaborate on any of
Yeah,
your...
sure. Right, so I say the main problem with what Brian is saying is that he takes a bunch of official rationales for government action as if they're really true. And yet when we start getting into specifics, then he's very willing to give them up. So he agrees with me on immigration. This is a immigration restriction. So again, just to be clear, yes, I'm a right-winger who is super pro-immigration. All right, so people often get confused, but that's the correct right-wing position, is pro-immigration, because it's about free markets and human labor, right? But and then similarly agnostic on housing. So here you have a system where they say we're using regulation to help people, and then I go and list the most important regulations that exist, and he says, yeah, well, I don't know about those, or they're wrong. It's not much of a defense of a position to say I endorse the theory, but the practice actually doesn't impress me. It's the kind of thing that should make you wonder, wow, maybe we just shouldn't be giving government this kind of power because we are handing them these weaponized rationales to demagogue, and then when you give them the power, they do terrible things. Let's see. On this idea of socialism is a system about enabling people to live freely. I mean, on the one hand, as a philosopher, Brian is free to define socialism however he wants, but this is not what almost any socialist, self-identified socialist throughout history has agreed with. There's a very long tradition in socialism devoted to attacking bourgeois freedom and saying that you think you're free, but you're really a slave. And if you're raised in a religion that's actually kind of oppression, you've been brainwashed and enslaved by the witchery of religion. Right? So again, it's one where if you define freedom to be the freedom to do whatever socialists want, then they favor freedom. But I think that is a rather misleading way to think about it. Now again, just getting briefly into philosophy, Brian did make this argument that if you have to take a job or starve, then you're not really free. How about if you have to be nice to the opposite gender or else be alone? Are you really free then? I say you are actually, because look, yes, it's really miserable to be alone, but on the other hand, if they don't want to spend time with you, that's their time to spend. Similarly, if a businessman does not want to give you a job, do you know where that job came from? Yeah, the business created that job. If he weren't around, you wouldn't have anything to complain about. Now, this is especially ridiculous in the real world when you have a vast number of options. So if Amazon doesn't want to sell you stuff, you really do have a lot of other places you can go to. Although I really hope that Amazon stays private because they're so awesome. It is the best store that ever existed in human history, and I'm super grateful for that. All right. Let's see. Now, this idea that the actual history of socialism for the last 250 years is irrelevant to any serious discussion.
It's not a 250-year history.
Yes.
It's about a century tops. Come on, Brian.
Well, we can argue that. No. So, French Revolution, you have a number of prominent socialists and a lot of socialist rhetoric and an attack on the market. So, I'll go back to at least that. So, yeah, that would come out to almost exactly 250 years. Right. In any case, but anyway, the idea that the history of what has happened is not relevant. What could be more relevant? What's more relevant? What some philosophers wrote about socialism, or what actual people in power who call themselves socialists have done? What gives you a better prediction about what's going to happen when socialists get in power? Exegesis of some old books, right? Or looking at what really happened, right? I think that is a rather relevant question. Let's see. On Bernie Sanders, I think actually there's a lot of question about what his real views are. So he said enough very favorable things about actual totalitarian communist regimes that you must wonder what his true view is. So you say, well, he never said, I favor a totalitarian communist regime. All right. But if someone spent their time talking about how great Hitler was and then said, no, I never said I was a Nazi, but yeah, you have to, at least you say, I'm worried. I'm worried that you would say things like this because it sounds kind of like what you would say if you agreed with it but still wanted to be elected. So be nervous. Be nervous. Let's see. So real GDP doubled under social democracy. Yeah, probably did that and more. Again, the question is just what would have happened otherwise. So again, when you go and take a look at all of the harm of regulation of the construction industry, just the way that now it is not affordable for regular people to live in New York City or the Bay Area, and there's no reason why business would not provide really cheap housing to everyone. If you just go and take a look at Google and see how they're starting to build a couple skyscrapers near Central Park, and then you realize, wow, why aren't there 300 skyscrapers around Central Park? And if there were 300 skyscrapers around Central Park, how expensive would it be to live there? Dirt cheap. Right? And who's stopping business from doing it? It's government, of course. And again, why are they doing it? Well, there's endless complaints. Oh, well, they might block out somebody's light. And just sit around trying to be negative and come up with every possible objection to building cheap housing in New York City. And you've got the argument for. And here's my argument for why we should deregulate. So people can live in New York City in really cheap housing. It would be awesome. And all of your other complaints are so petty. All right, so just leave that alone.
I want a
I think-
1 minute
yeah, I
survey.
think-
All right,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
yeah, finally,
we'll,
just let me
I
do
think we'll have to stop there.
I've got to do one last quick one. So, doom without socialism. All right, this argument that capitalism is going to automate your jobs away has been around, again, for about 150 years. It made a lot of sense when they were getting rid of agricultural jobs because agriculture provided almost all employment for almost all of human history. It would have been easy for people to say, what else will people do? And you know what? People do other stuff now. And this has always happened because there's always something else that you can do with human labor. When you automate something, you produce really cheap goods, and then you figure out something else for people to do. I don't know what it's going to be, but people in business do know because that's their job to figure out what to do next, and they're great at it. Thank you.
Can I have a brief reply? The job of people in business is to maximize their profit. It's not to provide jobs for people. That's absolutely clear. You must have never been in a business school. That is their job.
I know their job is to figure out a way to make money from workers.
From commenting specifically on construction regulation because it's not my area and it's also beyond preposterous to suggest that the high cost of living in San Francisco and New York is simply because of government regulation. But what I really would urge you to do is to prescind from commenting on what it is socialist philosophers have thought the point of socialism was. It was clearly freedom. Freedom is the animating ideal of socialism. You might want to say they're wrong. You might want to say socialism won't produce that. It was clearly the animating ideal. And if socialism doesn't achieve that, it's not worth having. I wouldn't quarrel with that.
So I actually wanted to follow up on that. Since that was your definition of socialism, how do you view then the relationship between collective and individual rights, the role of state power, how that trade-off? How do you view that today and in a socialist or socialist system?
Okay, so I hate to give the philosopher's answer and say that's a really complicated question. Suppose it was the case that the state took control of the production of Tyson Foods and Exxon and General Motors and so on, right? And I actually don't think they should do that today because I do think the entire premise of socialism is abundance. Without abundance, you get disaster, which is what we had in Mao's China and Castro's Cuba, all right? But if we have productive abundance and the government then takes control of the productive power to produce things people need and want, then we have to ask what impact does it have on any individual rights? Does it affect your ability to go to church or synagogue or mosque? Not obvious why it would. Does it affect your ability to agree with Professor Caplan or agree with Professor Leiter? Not obvious why it should. Does it affect your ability to decide that you want to dress like a goth or dress like a boring bourgeois professor? Right? Not obvious that it would. Okay? So under conditions of productive abundance, right, the fact that there is collective public control of the production of things people need and want doesn't obviously have anything to do with people's individual rights. Now, it would have a big effect on one individual right, namely the right of capitalists, right, to own productive power and to generate profit from it. that right goes by the wayside. And I'm not really brokenhearted about it, I have to confess.
Did you want to comment on your views on the role of state power relative to individual?
Sure. Yeah, I'm picturing a government takeover of Amazon and what that would do to me. Right? I think they would destroy the company very quickly. And all of us who enjoy their endless great products and great deals would then be suffering from that. So yes, of course, when you go and take over business, you are taking away the freedom of entrepreneurial people. And I will say, I would be totally broken up over that because they're awesome people. Entrepreneurs and business people are fantastic. They provide an endless bounty of stuff, and we should be super grateful to them, and I totally am. But it's also a matter of the freedom of the consumer to shop around. Right? So when you have a lot of businesses around, you as an individual have the right to go and find out who's offering the best deal and see who you like. And you can decide that you want to take your business somewhere else. You want to go and, so you can go and complain to them if you're so inclined. I would just go and say, I didn't like it here. I'm going to go someplace else. I'll review them on Yelp. I'd say that there is a very fundamental effect on human freedom from this. And again, you can go back to all the regimes that have called themselves socialist. Partly, yes, it's just true that they're super poor and disastrous, although again, a lot of their reason is they're poor is because they're socialists and because they don't have a very good system set up for production of things other than walls and automatic firing machine guns and nuclear weapons and space programs and Olympic teams, right? So they're great at those things. Right, but in terms of actually coming up with consumer goods that people want to enjoy, very bad at that. But again, if you just imagine the position there, if you don't like what the government's doing, you're really stuck. Right. So again, if you just think about the freedom that you felt in K through 12, so I can tell you how much freedom I felt like I had in K through 12, and that's almost none. Right now, you say, well, you were a child then; it was your parents that were deciding. Yeah, well, now I'm a parent, and you know what else? I don't see that my kids have much freedom in K through 12, even from my own point of view. That's why I took my older kids out of school to homeschool them, right? But, and then I guess so in terms of, just the question of socialist philosophers, I have actually spent many years reading socialist philosophers. A lot more reading about the history of actual socialist regimes, but you can't understand the one without the other, right? And I will say that if freedom means anything, then Brian's right. But if freedom means what it means in ordinary English, then it's just not true. So Marx on freedom of religion, right? It's not the words of someone who says each person should be free to worship in whatever manner they think fit. Rather, it's saying you're not really free if you just believe what your parents taught you, are you? You're not free if priests get inside your head and confuse you. You know what you're free when a socialist regime closed down all the churches, arrests all the priests.
Where does Karl Marx
Yes.
say that? Where exactly
Yes.
does he say that? Because you just
Yes.
made it up. You just
No,
made it up.
It's true. I read between the lines because there's some euphemisms. But yes, Karl Marx read.
Yes,
there
you
is
read
the line.
between the lines. You
Free,
just made it
free
up.
from the witchery of religion. And how do you get free from the witchery of religion? If religious people can't tell you their lies anymore.
Marx thought that people were attracted to religion because life under capitalism was a life of making decisions based on economic necessity and misery. That's why he thought people were attracted to religion. He didn't say any of the other things you made up. You just made them up. That's okay.
Yes.
You're allowed to.
So
You're an
again,
economist.
Yeah. Well, I encourage you to read Marx on the Jewish question tonight and see who you agree with. I will agree that Marx rarely comes and says, I am going to murder all the priests that I can get my hands on. On the other hand, it is if you read it as you would a typical a political writer, what else could he possibly mean if not government repression of people that disagree with him?
So I teach on the Jewish question quite a lot, and we could bore everyone to tears if I explain what the essay is actually about.
Yeah.
But I think we ought to go back to the
I
moderator.
think we'll stipulate. I do have one question. So, the old question about socialism is the problem of socialist calculation. How do we deal with information? How do we provide incentives? So both the older literature and the newer on private information and providing incentives. How in a government with public controlled ownership, how do we continue to provide incentives and also decide what to produce?
Okay, good. So under capitalism as we have it now, the only incentive provided for the vast majority of people is the incentive not to starve and die. That's the primary incentive that is currently available. And you're right, that actually works pretty well. Now, whether that's a decent way to treat people, whether it's compatible with freedom is a separate question. Now, Marx himself, and I'm not much interested in the history of Marxism after Marx, which is a somewhat sorry history from a philosophical point of view. But I want to emphasize something I said in my original remarks about Marx, right? Which is that Marx was a huge fan of capitalism, of Milton Friedman proportions, with one caveat, right? That is, he thought capitalism, precisely because of the incentives it creates for capitalist producers, creates productive plenty that wouldn't exist without it, right? And I think he's right about that. This is why Castro and Mao and others were just terrible Marxists, right? They actually, as far as I can tell, they just didn't read the text. Castro clearly didn't. Mao, I'm not so sure. So Marx presupposes that you can only have socialist production in circumstances where productive capacity is sufficient to allow for defects in things like the circulation of information, where you can allow for the fact that you don't need to threaten people with life and death in order to get them to do things, right? Because the socialist ideal is freedom in the sense of freedom to choose what it is you want to do, right? And very few of us have that freedom. Probably nobody in the room has the freedom to actually do the productive activity you want to engage in, independent of will someone pay you for it, will you get an hourly wage for it, right? Will you get your health insurance for it, and so on, right? So these are real questions, and when they're real questions now, partly because I'm not sure we have the productive power that is necessary for what Marx had in mind. Marx was very wrong about the timing, right? Like many thinkers in the mid-19th century, he was not atypical in this regard. He was kind of utopian about the productive power, because the change in the productive power of the Western world between 1750 and 1850 was enormous. It was extraordinary. And people really thought manna would be falling from heaven, except if it's all owned by capitalism, it'll only be falling in one pot, right? And everybody else will be left out. And that really was the background assumption, I think, that Marx was working with. And the question is, are we there? When will we be there? And what do we do when we get there?
So rather than responding, I'll ask you a question, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So have them ready. So I'll ask one more, and then we'll go to the floor. So for Brian, I actually want to have you react to Senator Sanders' response to the question of should billionaires exist. Right? So one issue which hasn't come up today or has only been touched on briefly has been inequality, which has become a growing concern for many people, and I think is perhaps motivated some of the recent interest in socialism. So Senator Sanders said, we have a grotesque and immoral distribution of wealth and income. Mike Bloomberg owns more wealth than the bottom 125 million Americans. That's wrong. That's immoral. That should not be the case when we have 500,000 people sleeping out on the street. How do you respond to that?
I'd say it very much depends upon how you made your money. So I don't know how Mike Bloomberg has made his money, but if he had made it by building 300 skyscrapers around Central Park, then I'd say he deserves every penny of that, right? On the other hand, if you make it through government contracts for the military, then maybe not. But again, I'd say, like, what did he actually do to get that money, right? Now, and again, in terms of the incentives, there's the obvious point of, well, if you can't be a billionaire, then why not just stop once you are nearing $1 billion? And do you really want to go and limit the production and the creativity of people that are capable of doing that? But again, I also just say, why are you angry at them? They produced a lot of stuff. They organized people voluntarily into going great things. And why would you complain about that? Now, again, when you talk about the exploitation of capitalists, what's striking to me is when you go to the third world, we have this image in the third world, they're crushed under the boot of capitalist and corporate oppression. This is totally untrue. If you go to the third world, you'll see there's very little business, very few corporations. Instead, there's just a lot of incompetent self-employment. That's actually what's going on when you go to the third world. Very few people even have paid employment at all. They're just going and very desperately trying to run a business. So you can just think about most of the people you know and how good they would be at running a business. They're not. Right? So really what I say is I feel sorry for them for not having access to the employment that we have here in the US, where you have the best employers, the best managers that really can take people that aren't very good at running their own business and organize them into a very productive unit. Right? I mean, by the way, on this point of your only choice is either work or starve, mean, this was crazy even 200 years ago, but it's really crazy today. Now it's more like you have a choice of either keep working or you can't afford a Rolex watch, right? Most of what people spend their money on is total luxuries, right? And if you just think about how frugally you could live if you really wanted to, right? You would only have to work for a few years. You could go and move to the middle of nowhere where housing's cheap, go to Lubbock, Texas, right? And you could then go and eat food from Aldi's for the rest of your life, and you could work for a few years in the U.S. and you could afford to do that.
These are good lines, but you're just making stuff up, Brian. I gotta tell you, most people are choosing between working so they can have a Rolex watch or not.
Yes, I didn't say most people. Let's see. So a Rolex
How many?
watch is an example of a
One
luxury.
out of 200
Yes.
million?
A Rolex is an example of a luxury product. The point where I will stand by is most people spend most of their money on total luxuries. You don't have to live in a nice area of the country. You could go and live in Lubbock, Texas, where housing is really cheap. You can go and buy your food from Walmart or Aldi's, and you will find it's amazingly affordable to live in the U.S. if that's all you want to do.
Have you been to Lubbock?
I have been to Lubbock, yes.
There are poor people in Lubbock.
Yes, there are. And it's an interesting question as to what's going wrong. Of course, the main cause of poverty in the U.S. is simply not having a full-time job, right? And then the next biggest cause is spending your money on non-necessities. If you really just wanted to live in a frugal way, it would be very easy to do. But of course, hardly anyone wants to do that because it's boring and it's not fun. And also, you'd have to be a big nonconformist. Most people want to do what other people are doing. But again, this is a plight that should engender far less sympathy. It's like, well, gee, I have to work if I want to live in Manhattan. Oh yeah, well, I guess you will. But there's plenty of other places you could live. You're not going to be dead if you go to Lubbock. You might feel it's boring or
Do
not
we have a
friendly.
fact checker here?
So we'll stipulate to Lubbock as well.
Okay.
Professor Leiter, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about morality or immorality of distribution of wealth, and then we'll.
Well, I'll
take
make a
questions.
comment about inequality since I've already interjected on the make-believe. I don't think inequality per se is ever the issue. I mean, I think the problem with extreme inequality economic inequality in the United States is the way it distorts the political process. Now, we saw, of course, an example of this with Mike Bloomberg, though on the other hand, he got blown out of the water. He won American Samoa, and that was it. But on the other hand, it's well documented by political scientists that the wealthy get their interests much better represented in government policy, right, because of capture, than those who have less money. That's a serious problem, right? But I'm inclined to the view that if everybody has enough in order to be genuinely free, right? That is to choose what they want to do to lead a meaningful life, and that's really what people are after. Not particularly Rolexes; those people are out there, but they aren't really relevant to the issue. It doesn't really matter whether some people have an enormous amount, as far as I can see. So I don't view inequality per se as the crucial issue.
Great. All right, we'll open up to questions from the floor. Oh, we have one right here.
I don't know if it was by design that probably the most important issue that faces mankind on Earth has been totally ignored by both sides here. But I would like both sides to address how would a socialist society deal with the environmental crisis, and how would a market capitalist approach? I think I can almost guess what I'm going to hear from this side because he likes Amazon so much. And Amazon's boss already has a plan, which is we're all going to go to another planet.
So we'll start with.
Yeah. So part of the reason that climate change is not being dealt with is because we live under global capitalism, and that is productive decisions are made with an eye to the profits of owners. And we can't resolve the climate change problem without taking that out of the equation. It's pretty much that simple, right? Communities as a whole have an obvious interest in averting climate change, right? New York City, Miami, and so on, they have a very powerful interest. But they don't own they don't own Exxon, they don't control it. So a socialist global economy would be in a much better position to deal with the issue of climate change. When we're dealing with private entities, right, who exist to maximize profit, and we have huge collective action problems, as the economists would point out, it's going to be very difficult to get anything done. And that, of course, is exactly what we're seeing, right? Namely, almost nothing is being done, almost nothing at all at this point. So, I don't think that with a capitalist global economy we have any chance. So we're all screwed on that front. How screwed we are is going to depend where we are. Madison and Chicago will be better off than Miami and New York, but that's like saying I'm in the lifeboat that's not sinking.
So since Brian doesn't like to talk about actual socialist regimes, but I do. So actual socialist regimes had terrible environmental records, according to almost anyone who's looked at the numbers. So it's very hard to understand how socialism would be a cure for anything unless you just define socialism equals socialism that works. In terms of what you can do under market capitalism, so there's an entire field called environmental economics. And in this area, they talk about, well, what are at least the most modest deviations you can do from a free market and still deal with these problems? And the standard answer is, if there's a pollutant that's causing harm, you tax it. And if it's causing a lot of harm, then you tax it a lot. Right? And this seems like a very reasonable answer, especially when you can say, well, for a lot of pollutants, you could actually say it is a violation of other people's property rights and bodies to be able to do them, so you don't have any untrammeled right to go and do it. So again, like if you're talking about particulate, tax it. If you're talking about carbon, tax it. Right? And again, in terms of what you're going to do on a whole planet like this, you may say, well, like the rich would never go for this, corporations never go for this. The main thing to remember is that you can do this as part of a deal where you cut other taxes. So it's very hard to understand why this is so difficult. And again, by the way, even in the scenario where automation is putting people out of work, there's still a really standard social democratic solution that doesn't nationalize Amazon, and that's just raise taxes and have more redistribution. So again, as to what is this fetish with saying there's a problem so bad that only a system that's never worked can deal with it, I really don't get it.
Can I respond to that last
Can you respond to that answer?
thing? Because I really want Professor Caplan to engage fairly on my terms without the caricatures, okay? So, first of all, I'm glad to hear you're for social democracy. This is the first moment I heard this tonight, right? Which is that, well, social democracy can deal with the problem that people are being put out of work. But the question is, given the fundamental logic of a capitalist system, which is to reduce production costs in order to increase profitability, what happens to all of us who are simply production costs? And you sort of waved your hand and said, well, there'll be new things that come along. Well, what if there aren't? Then what happens? That's the question. What happens at that point? Right? And you don't know, and I don't know, and you can't guarantee that anything will come along, that we will all become superfluous, right, in the capitalist future. That's a possibility, right?
I cannot give you an absolute guarantee. That's true.
Excellent.
Because this is the real world. There are no absolute guarantees in the real world.
For Professor Caplan, I would at least just like to ask, fundamentally, isn't the notion of free market capitalism fundamentally anti-democratic in that it reduces citizens to simply factors of production and consumers?
So I have a whole book critiquing democracy, so I'm tempted to say, yeah. But no, I say that free market capitalism is totally consistent with democracy if people vote for it.
But if people can't control their local communities, and it seems like your biggest grievance against the construction industry is that local control of building codes and such is a tremendous shackle on free market capitalism. How do people get to practice democracy if they can't vote to control the conditions in their own communities?
Well, what I would urge them to do is to vote to stop doing it, to vote for freedom and let people build skyscrapers and lots of multifamily dwellings and so on. So again, there's no logical tension between democracy and what I'm saying. I'm just saying, everyone, vote for what I think is good, now, forever. However, I'm very happy to admit, so if you look at my first book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, the whole book is about how democracy delivers bad policies. And why? Because democracy votes for what's emotionally appealing, not for what's really good. Right? And you can say, well, does that mean you're not a big fan of democracy? Yeah, that's right. I'm not a big fan of democracy. Doesn't make me a fan of dictatorship. I'm a fan of markets. Right? And I would rather there just not be a vote on markets, actually. But if we do, then I urge people to vote markets.
Hi, my question goes out to Professor Caplan. So the minimum wage here in Wisconsin is $7.25, which is around $15,000 a year, and 13 million Americans are working more than one job. So my problem is when you said that Americans are poor because they're not working hard enough, and that it's their fault. So do you still think that this is true considering these statistics?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, remember, I'm not saying that having a full-time job is an absolute guarantee against poverty. Rather, there's a lot of work trying to explain what is that makes people poor, and your odds of being poor if you work a full-time job in the United States are extremely low. Most people who are poor either work part-time or don't have jobs at all. Now, if you're trying to figure like how can we make the math work? So, step one, of course, is get a roommate. Then you're talking $30,000 to go and divide between the two of you. Now, if I don't know about your housing regulation here in Wisconsin or in Madison, I suspect it's bad. So housing is expensive here. But again, if you go and look at a place like Lubbock, then it's looking really good. But again, remember, only a very small fraction of Americans work for the minimum wage. So, and again, I would say, like if you just look at median wage just for someone who finished high school is a lot higher than minimum wage. And then, of course, as you go through life, you generally will get a higher salary. So, yeah, I totally stand by what I said.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my question is to Professor Kaplan. Do you think free market capitalism can get the bottom 30% people out of poverty?
So, bottom 30% of the U.S. or bottom 30% of the world?
Of course, U.S.
Yeah.
And my second question is, can free market capitalism ensure that your pay is commensurate with your skills?
All right. So let me do the second question first. So can it ensure your pay is commensurate with your skills? No. There's no ensuring anything in the real world. However, on average, is there a high correlation between productivity and pay in capitalist economies? There is. Even in socialist economies, they actually have considerable inequality and people with more skills make more money. So it's not just capitalist systems. But again, so there's a whole field called industrial psychology where they go and try to measure people's job performance. And in some industries, they can even measure exactly how many widgets you make per hour and that kind of thing. And is there a perfect correlation between that and pay? No. Is there a high correlation? There is. In terms of getting rid of poverty, so if you mean absolute poverty where you're on the verge of starvation, I'd say we've already gotten rid of it for all but a very few people, all but maybe the homeless. But again, I would actually go further and say, if you really listen to me, we can also get rid of it for the bottom 30% of the world where there's actual suffering. Like how? Like I said, free migration. Let people move from poor countries to rich countries and get a job. Which, again, if you read my book, this is not just some empty throwaway line. I have been pushing this very strong for years. If you go and look at what is the best way for a person born in a poor country to get out of global poverty, it really is move to the first world and get a job. Right. So again, I would say that by world and historic standards, they're not even poor, generally. So if you really want to be poor in the U.S., then you need to be either very unlucky, like if you're born severely handicapped or something like that, or if there's a terrible recession and you're in a bad area of the country, right, and you've got no friends, no family, etc. Otherwise, I would say that problem is already extremely mild.
Okay. So Professor Kaplan's gotten the last couple of comments. I don't know if you had any reactions to that, and if to what you've heard for the last
So the
several
difficulty
minutes.
in arguing with Professor Kaplan about this is that he makes very brash generalizations about why are people poor and how poor they are and so on. And I don't think they have any factual basis. I think they're just, anecdotes. And, if there's a literature, if there's a systematic study that shows these things, that would be interesting. Now, I'm a casual consumer of this literature, and I can't think of anything that supports it. I think
Google the success sequence.
Cheap debaters tricks. You make things up. You talk about as though these things are true and explain stuff, and it's all fiction. So I'm not sure what to do except say,
Yes. So, it's not fiction. On the poverty particularly, go and Google the success sequence. So this is work showing that if you, first of all, finish high school, second of all, work full time, and third of all, don't have kids until you are married, your odds of being in poverty in the U.S. are about 2%.
So I'll follow up on that with the high school part. I work in a high school, so I'm curious, we have high school students, we have many university students here. What do we focus on? If I look at one side here, it's focus on the incentives, don't starve and die. Or over here, it's, the marketplace and Amazon is the way to go. What do I tell my students? Where do I go from this? What do I say is the way to a path to find a good future for the balance between a marketplace and a socialist economy?
So I would encourage students to learn history. So there's a data set by Angus Madison which estimates GDP per capita all over the world throughout history. Is it perfect? No. But I think it's a great place to start. It's something that's actually pretty easy to download, and just to get an idea of how bad things were throughout almost human history, how great they are by comparison today, how awful they are or how awful they were in socialist countries. So, I would just put a lot of time on that. Now, honestly, that's basically going to give you the comparison between real socialism, actually existing socialism, and the better social democracies. But even that, I think, is a really good thing for students to learn, right? And so I would focus on that. And then, again, of course, self-servingly, I'd say assign my open borders, just to get an idea of what a horribly destructive set of regulations countries have, which, again, all in the guise of going and protecting their countries from mass invasion of foreign workers. But I say in the book, it's basically just impoverishing mankind by trapping talent in unproductive countries.
Look, Adolf Hitler would not have come to power but for the capitalist class in Germany. But I haven't spent the entire evening saying there's real existing capitalism. Even though it is obvious to anyone who is sober, right, that every country that has called themselves socialist has nothing to do with socialism, you keep recurring to this. So explain Hitler, right? Was he not a good enough market capitalist? How about Pinochet, the fascist butcher in Chile? He was a big believer in Chicago School of Economics. He would have loved you. Is that your fault? Is that your fault?
Let's see. Interesting question.
But that's the way you're arguing again and again, and it's dishonest.
Yes, I disagree. So, the difference between Hitler and Pinochet. So Pinochet, by standard counts, killed about 2,000 people, and Hitler killed tens of millions of people. So there's one small difference there. Also, of course, you don't like counting what people call themselves, but I do. Yes, Nazis, National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler continued a large number of the social programs of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which was a Marxist party that preceded him. In terms of German business complicity with Hitler, so what I would say is there were a few that did, and then there were a lot of others who went and submitted to him because they saw he was going to be the winner, right? I don't say that business people are heroic. They rarely stick their necks out for principles, but the idea that they particularly wanted to have some crazy guy take over, they wanted to have some moderate guy that would continue the status quo is, I think, the more reasonable story.
No, but I think in general, let's try to orient our attention to more of the topics at hand. I think
You don't need to address that to me.
I think Godwin's law has been passed a long time ago here. So we have another question.
I'd just like to know more about the wage disparity between the profits of a company and what the workers take home versus what an owner takes home, and how low can it go before we become just a serfdom with no freedom at all, and everybody's just kind of like slave laborers?
Well, gee. Of course, workers could be getting a very small share, but if the pie was big enough, they'd still be doing well. Again, when people try to measure what is a typical profit rate for a business, it's usually around 5%. There's a lot of problems with doing that because you have to figure, well, should the owner's labor count when we're doing that? But by almost any measure, what the profits that people think that the typical business is getting are much smaller rates than they actually are. Of course, the most successful businesses do great, right? But again, as to why I should be, anyone working for Amazon or not should feel unhappy because Amazon's making a lot of money. I guess Amazon is now finally making money anyway. Uber's not.
We're gonna lie. So anyone particularly have a question for Professor Leiter? We've had many going the other way.
Okay, Professor, you said the socialist ideal is somewhere where you're free to choose what you want, right? What do you think of a system where, at the federal level, the government is largely free market libertarian, and you have certain provinces or states where, perhaps a more socialist ideal works, and people are free to choose wherever they want to move, and let the people decide with their feet, right? You don't have to bring in a system that coerces everyone, but you have these small pockets where you're free to move in if you choose to, and that's the ultimate indicator of whether people prefer socialism versus whatever else there is. What's your reaction to such a system?
Okay, so, it depends on what the conditions of choice are for expressing your preferences about where you want to live. And it depends, of course, on what level of information people have about what the different options are. If we satisfied all those concerns, we'd probably get some information about human preferences, right? But I'm actually not aware of circumstances where we've ever been able to satisfy the necessary conditions for the choice to be a meaningful choice, to really reflect, right, their views about the competing merits of different ways of organizing production. But if it were possible, sure.
Yeah, so I am an advocate of free market capitalism. Okay.
I knew that. I've been watching your head.
I think the issue of freedom has been flipped on its head. I think the biggest argument for free market capitalism is that it supports individual freedom. By my definition of socialism, it's the individual person giving control of their life to the collectivist nature of socialism for the greater good of the society as determined by the leaders.
That's not what socialism is. It's got nothing to do with it. So I agree with you. That would have nothing to do with freedom.
I think that's what it always has evolved to.
In countries
Explain
that
to me
had
what
not
happened in
undergone
the Soviet
capitalism.
Union. How can you?
What
not
happened in the
say-
Soviet Union? They shouldn't have been a socialist society. And they weren't
so-
initially. Did you know that?
so the fatal
Did you
flaw
know
in
that
your-
initially that Lenin had instituted capitalist relations of production, right? Because he recognized he was less stupid and less crazy than Stalin, that was necessary. But I agree with you, the issue is freedom. What is meant by freedom? If I put a gun to your head and say, give me your tie, are you free?
Is it free?
Are you free,
If I
yes
work
or
my
no?
whole life to build up my life and it's redistributed to others, is that free?
Depends what you mean by redistributing your life. Redistributing your life? No, that's not
Redistribution of
free.
everything I've worked for my life. For
If
the
you're
greater
talking
good
about
of
what
a small group of leaders in society come up with their goals on what we need to do.
I have no defense of that proposition because it's got nothing to do with socialism.
Well,
It
as
has
I
nothing
see
to do
it,
with socialism.
it's collectivism.
I defined
it's
three
making
terms.
deci-
Collectivism wasn't one of them. I don't know what collectivism is. But I ask you the question,
So-
are you free if I put the gun, are you free if I
I'm
tell
not-
you?
No one is free with a gun to their head.
Okay, good.
That's an absurd
What's the
question.
difference? It's not absurd. What's the difference between having a gun to your head and being told unless you work this job for a certain wage,
Listen,
you can't pay for any food? What's the difference?
I grew up in America.
What's the
of
difference between those
modest
two
means.
cases?
Nobody ever told me I had to do this, I had to do that.
Lots of people told you you had to do
I made
things.
choices.
I'm
Everybody
sure
has
lots
to
of
make
people
choices.
told you because
And that's
everybody's been
The
told
beauty of
that.
America is the ability to make choices for yourself.
To make some choices for yourself, yes, but
No,
not
but-
lots of other choices.
Well,
You
yes, I
can't
mean,
make,
we-
there's lots of choices you can't
Yeah.
make. Lots of choices I can't make. That's the reality.
Well, anyway, to me, the issue is freedom. I see freedom on the side of
I get that.
private enterprise, not collectivism.
I don't know what
And I also
collectivism
think
is,
it's
so I have no
very,
comment about that.
Very misleading that you have linked Nazism to free market capitalism. That is
It's-
inflammatory.
Is it
wrong.
is it more inflammatory than what Professor Kaplan's been doing? Come on.
Hitler was a socialist.
No, he wasn't. He was a
Hitler-
social democrat.
Hitler was
Like
a
Bismarck.
military. He took control of his economy. He took control of the entire German
He preserved the
state,
capitalist domain.
the military system,
Okay.
and he was a racist. And he was
I agree
an
with that.
anti-Semite.
I agree with that.
He was about collectivism and taking control of people's individual freedom.
He was also about that too, I agree. Because he was supported by the capitalist class in Germany.
Thank you. Yeah. I
People don't
think-
like the facts, I understand. It's unpleasant.
I think we're refraining from further comments on Nazi Germany would do us all a great service.
How
tonight.
about Stalin? Are we going to refrain from further
We'll
comments on that?
We'll stipulate that as well.
Excellent.
Okay. All right. So it sounds to me as if actually both of you are social democrats in the capacious sense of that word. And the question, as I see the distinctions, is how much and when the government will kick in. And, sort of, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Professor
Actually, I would say you are, but
Okay.
Yeah.
So, that you're willing to accept that government can step in to solve externalities, for example, or
very severe externalities where there's no cheaper, more humane way of doing it. But
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
But
so
again,
maybe I'm
a very
overstating-
strong, I said, very strong presumption against doing anything, and then open-minded about making a few exceptions.
Okay, okay. So maybe I am overstating it, but I guess I wanted to get us back to sort of, a place we started with the idea of moving from social democracy, which we all basically have in one flavor or another, to socialism and this idea of capitalist abundance. Because I know Professor Leiter started with, from 1946 to 1980, when we had a stronger, in the United States at least, a stronger social democratic makeup. Wages of the bottom went up relative to wages of the top. But of course, since 1980, obviously that's flipped in the United States, but the global Gini coefficient has gotten so much better since 1980. And so I'm wondering, when we think about this idea of capitalist abundance, is it really, Australia has, 14 million, 18 million people. Canada has 28 million people. Sweden has 6 million people. Is it really possible to have sufficient capitalist abundance in a world of 7 billion people? And so, and maybe this is a question just for Professor Leiter, but, I'd love to hear, Professor Caplan's thoughts about that as well.
Good, thanks for that. Australia actually has 25 million people. Canada has about 36 to 38 million. But that doesn't change a basic point, which is that whether we can have productive abundance on a planet with 7 billion people is not clear, right? And this may be a fatal problem for the socialist ideal. I'm happy to concede that. I just don't know whether the productive capacity that would be necessary is compatible with actually sustaining a planet. So that's a real question, and I don't have a view about that. Because I think it's a hard question about predicting the future and the environmental impacts and so on. So I accept that that's a serious worry. I will say the global Gini coefficient is one thing, and the Gini coefficient in what were the highly developed social democratic capitalist countries is another. And I think they have diverged. That is, in some things have gone worse in the social democratic capitalist countries, even as they have gotten better elsewhere, and they've gotten better elsewhere for exactly Marxist reasons, I hate to say it, right? Namely that unfettered capitalism there has raised the bottom from where it was, from where it was previously. That's the story of China since, Deng, right? Deng Xiaoping was a better communist than Mao because he understood that it was crazy. You had to have capitalist development in order to deal with 700 million people living in poverty. So this is one area where I think actually Professor Caplan and I agree, namely that capitalism works better in developing productive capacity than any system of economic relations we have seen in the history of the world. The problem is that it gets to a point where the rest of us are dispensable, and that's the issue we have to confront.
Yeah, so I'd say I'm super optimistic about ending poverty on Earth. We can either do it quickly via open borders, right, and just let people move from countries that don't work very well to rich ones and get jobs and increase the production of mankind that way. That's the shortcut. Or we can do what we've been doing, where you just wait for international investment and technology and managerial techniques to spread. And that's been working really quickly too. It would always be nicer if it were quicker, but if you just look at the share of the world that lives on less than $1 a day, that has plummeted in the last few decades. So I don't see any reason why that shouldn't go down almost to zero. There's always going to be a few places like North Korea or countries with wars where things are terrible. But we have the technology. We can do it. It's just a matter of, are we going to do it the quick way of letting people move to the countries that work right away, or are we going to wait for capitalism to be exported and have other countries catch up that way? But either way, I'm not really, for 100 years, I'm not worried.
Okay, I appreciate there's many more questions than we have time for. We have time for one final question, which is right here.
I guess this would be a question for both of you in terms of, I didn't hear any examples of, we heard about Sweden. We heard no examples on the other side of that, which is examples of free market capitalism that you see as the opposite side of the spectrum, that examples that work and why they work.
Yeah, so totally fair question. Now, if you go and look at standard measures of capitalism versus socialism, how capitalist countries are, one of the countries that comes up near at the top is actually allegedly a socialist country, according to Brian, and that's Singapore. Hong Kong, maybe you wouldn't dispute as much, I don't know, although, of course, you got government ownership of land. So
Social democratic.
Yes.
I don't think
Yeah,
Singapore is
but I
socialist.
say, again, like by most measures, the most capitalist countries on earth, the least social democratic countries are Hong Kong, Singapore, the United States, Canada, Australia, UK. Right now, again, I'm happy to say those are still social democratic countries. So like what would not count? I would actually say like US before 1921, right? That was one where there were still almost open borders. It like ended in 1921, so 1920 is my magic year, right? Of course, you still have great freedom to build. So like there are some other policies that are bad. You still have Jim Crow in the South, so not perfect. Again, my view on whenever you're assessing a system, you always want to start with what's the country closest to your ideal, and then look at what happens when you move further in the direction of your ideal. Right? And again, I think this is a lot of the disagreement that Brian and I have, is that I keep saying, let's start with actual socialist countries and then think about how your differences would have made them better. Right? And he doesn't appreciate that. I think that's reasonable. But similarly, I'm happy to start with the most capitalist countries and then say, I want the US, but with open borders and freedom to build and no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no public education, all those things. That's where I would go. And again, for each of those, of course, there's a whole argument about each one. So for education, I have a book, The Case Against Education, making the case this is actually a giant waste of public money and things would have been better if government had not subsidized it. But again, it's a big issue.
All right. All right. Thank you all for the questions. We'll now turn to brief closing statements. We'll start with Professor Leiter.
Well, I actually just want to say something about Singapore. I mean, Singapore is a highly social democratic nation. They have national health insurance in the sense that everyone has health insurance, but it's provided different ways. Some of it is provided by the government, some is through private insurance that's heavily regulated. But even more than that, to go back to where we started with poor San Francisco and the unaffordability of housing, the Singaporean government owns most of the housing. Right? They heavily subsidize it. More than that, they require people to live in housing according to religious groups to ensure integration, right? In order to reduce social conflict. It's been hugely successful. So they are, part of the reason they have this reputation as this global center of capitalism is because they're very favorable to, international banking. Tax rates are very low. That's the way in which they're very capitalist. In every other respect, they are dramatically social democratic. And among other things, to bring it back to the issue that's always on everybody's mind today, they're doing fabulously well with regard to the coronavirus because they have socialized medicine, but also because they're slightly authoritarian. So it's easier for them to require people to quarantine and things like that. But not a single person has died in Singapore. Now, that doesn't go to our fundamental issue tonight. And the fundamental issue is, and I think this was an important concession by Professor Caplan, which is that I pointed out what the logic of capitalism is, and he hasn't disputed it. The logic of capitalism and capitalists is to reduce their production costs, right? We, almost all of us, are production costs of capitalism. And the question is how that ends. And there's no reason to think that it will end well. And that's the question that we're going to have to confront. Maybe not in this election, maybe not in the next 50 years, but in the next 100 to 2 years in the United States, we're going to have to confront that too. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Caplan.
All right. So on technological unemployment, to repeat, people have been worried about this for a very long time, and they've been totally wrong every time. Right? Of course, and then the first time around was the scariest because capitalists figured out a way to grow a ton of food with hardly any people. And you might have thought, how can we get rid of the job that almost every human being has had for almost all of recorded human history? And we did. We totally did that. Right? And if you would ask people at the time, what are they going to do instead? I don't think they would have said, well, there'll be like a big industrial revolution, and then there'll be an information age, it's all going to be great. Instead, they would have been quite dumbstruck, but nevertheless, it happened. Now, what's the logic? It is true that capitalists want to go and cut costs for a given quantity of production. However, that doesn't mean that they want to employ as few people as possible. It means they want to figure out useful things to do with people. When you come with new machines, this changes what people are useful for. And then an entrepreneurial mind doesn't say, well, people are garbage, I don't need them anymore. Instead they said, well, they still want to work, right? Yeah? Well, what could they do? What could they do? And there's always been an answer to this. And why is there always an answer? I say it's pretty simple, because human beings have enormous potential. We can do a great many things, and people have creative ideas, and they can always figure out some additional useful thing to do. This has worked every time. By the way, I did have a bet on this during the last recession where my colleague Tyler Cowen did say, this time, Brian, it really is different. And I said, no, it's not. It's never been different. It's not different again. He actually gave me a bet that unemployment would stay above 5% for 20 years. And he gave me 10-to-1 odds. And he lost within 3 years. All right. So now, again, that's just one bet. All right. Yes, it's just one bet. But again, it just shows how even people who ought to know better just look at someone being automated out of a job and see doom. And there's just no reason to think that's going to happen. Now, just on the broader questions. For socialism, I would just say we should be ultra negative. Ultra negative. Right? Now, Brian wants to say, well, real socialism doesn't say this. What I'll say, I think it's reasonable to say real socialism is what people who call themselves socialists generally thought. Right? Most people who have called themselves socialists throughout history would not agree with Brian. Right? They would say their systems were, in fact, good examples of socialism. It's only when there's a total collapse that then people come along and say, oh, that wasn't real socialism. The people in the regimes anyway. And of course, there's also a lot of Western fans. Anyway, so socialism, we'll just say, is a total non-starter, and you should have a very closed mind about it, right? And if you have an open mind, just go and read about the actual experience to get your mind properly closed. Doom and gloom. Whenever people talk about it, just say, wow, this isn't going to work. It's going to be terrible, right? Venezuela is the last time. A lot of optimism at first, and then terrible stuff. And then, of course, what? Amnesia. So Venezuela, that wasn't socialist. So when you said it was working, you thought it was. But again, well, what I really want to say is we shouldn't just stop at social democracy and say we've already got the best system. We don't have a great system, right? But like I say, when we go and actually draw a clear contrast between propaganda and reality, what social democracies say they're doing to make the world better is actually making things worse overall. They like to go and say we're helping the poor. When you look at what they're doing, they do a lot of things to hurt the poor. They keep poor migrants out. They keep low-income housing from being built. They keep multifamily housing from being built. They waste most of the redistributive budget on people who are not poor. Right? So again, look at what they're actually doing and then step back and say, maybe actually it's not just socialism that's a bad idea. It's social democracy too. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you all for coming.